May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, first of all, happy Father's Day. If you were expecting to hear a lovely little sermon about how fathers reflect the role of God as our Father and something very father-centric, that's not what we're doing today. We've just had too much going on in the country at large and with Joe and Stephanie, so no disrespect to fathers. I have one of my own that I'm very fond of, but that's not what we're talking about today. So one of my favorite comic strips, which is sadly no more, is Calvin and Hobbes. If you didn't read it, it was the ongoing adventures of a hyperactive 6-year-old boy with a very vivid imagination named Calvin and his stuffed tiger, Hobbes. And one of the recurring storylines was Calvin's run-ins with a bully at his school. He was a big, mean kid named Mo. On one of these strips, in most of the panels, there's no dialogue. Mo just comes up to Calvin on the playground and takes his lunch money and shoves him into the dirt and walks off. And Calvin gets up, all dirty and scuffed, and in the last panel, he looks up at the sky and he yells, "It is very hard to maintain belief in you when certain people are never incinerated by bolts of lightning." I found myself thinking a lot about this strip this week. Because of everything we've been hearing and seeing about Orlando, and all the praying and worrying we've been doing about Father Joe and Stephanie, who will now be starting her cancer treatment in San Francisco. It's one of these times when you're tempted to look up at the sky and yell, "What are you planning to do about all this anyway? Are you even there?" Elijah is in exactly one of those places. In our first reading, he's gone and just caused a huge amount of trouble, including killing a bunch of people, which God told him to do. And now, understandably, he's in big trouble with King Ahab. So he heads out into the wilderness and he asks God to let him die. Now, if he'd really wanted to just die, he could have just stayed where he was and let Ahab kill him. But no, this is Elijah's kind of passive-aggressive way of asking God, "Would you fix this for me, please?" Elijah is kind of passive-aggressive like that. So when the angel comes and gives him the food and water, he must be thinking, okay, here we go. God is going to be dealing with this mess. So he eats the food, he goes into the wilderness for 40 days because for some reason everything in the Bible takes 40 days. And then the voice of God asks him why he's there. And he explains, well, I did everything you told me to do, and now I am in terrible trouble and they're going to kill me. And the voice says, okay, go stand on the mountain over there because God is going to come deal with this personally. And Elijah goes where he's told, thinking, I'm sure, finally. And then what happens next is really interesting. There's this huge wind so big it can tear down a mountain. And Elijah couldn't be blamed for thinking, well, this is God speaking, because God appears in dramatic ways like this all over the Old Testament. But God is not in the wind this time. But then there was an earthquake, and I mean, that has to be a sign from God, right? No, God's not in the earthquake. The earthquake stops, and then the fire appears, and Elijah's thinking, this must be it, because God appears in the guise of fire all the time. It's his thing. The burning bush and the pillar of fire that guided the Israelites through the desert. I mean, he loves doing the fire thing. But no, not this time. God is not in fire. He is in what's left after all these big, fancy, attention-getting special effects go away. God is in the silence. For me, that is an absolutely terrifying idea. I have had a lifelong problem since I was a little girl with anxiety and panic attacks. And when I am actively going through one of those episodes, the very last thing that I want around me is silence. When I'm scared and I'm trying to get out of being scared, I avoid quiet and being alone as much as I possibly can. For me, in those times, silence is the perfect breeding ground for fear and anger and despair. I will go to any lengths to avoid being quiet and alone, where feelings like that can just come and grab me. I would much rather get my answers from an earthquake or from a fire than from silence. And I don't think I'm alone in feeling that way. When we as a whole population are going through something big and painful and scary, and we look to God for an answer, we want a big, dramatic answer. We want a sign in the heavens. We want a miraculous parting of the sea. We want to see a lame man get up and walk. We probably even want certain people to be incinerated by bolts of lightning. And it doesn't make us happy at all when we look up in the sky and yell, "Why? What do we do? What do you want?" And we are met with silence. Why does God communicate with us by way of silence? Wouldn't it be more effective if he did give us messages in the big, loud, impressive ways? Well, yeah, and no. Loud communication certainly does work. When you hear thunder, you get inside, because you know it's going to start raining. When your kid runs out into the street and you yell, "Get back on the sidewalk," he does not get hit by the car that, of course, he didn't think to look for. So loud gets the point across. It's perfect for the situation where there is a clear, immediate point to be made and there is no room for argument. But it doesn't really communicate to the heart. Even when loud communication is necessary, and of course sometimes it is, it's not really welcome, is it? There's something else to consider too. Loud communication is pretty much always one way. When thunder booms, it is not expecting us to boom back, and it would not care if we did. Think about any time you've either been in or witnessed a conversation, we'll call it that, in which both of the parties were yelling. Here's a clue. If you've ever watched cable news, there you go. Was either one listening to the other person at all? Or was it two one-way tirades that were just taking place at the same time? In silence, though, there's a lot more than just a straightforward command. There's space for agitation and fear and panic to run their course and give way to peace and stillness. When we're frightened or angry or agitated or upset, we have so many arguments that we want to raise and so many reasons to demand justice and denounce the person or the situation that has wronged us. Silence gives us the opportunity to stop demanding an answer from God and make ourselves ready to actually hear the answer. In silence, we can move past being swept up in pain and terror and anger of the immediate situation and arrive at a place of calm and reason where we can actually do instead of just feel or react. And this is exactly what happens to Elijah. He's going to God hoping to hear, "Oh, you poor dear prophet, I am so sorry those terrible people are after you. I am going to smite them right now, and I'm going to send you on a nice vacation." But God gives Elijah more work to do. Our reading ends right at this point, but in the next few verses, God commands Elijah to go out and anoint a new king and to train a successor for himself, which was probably not the comforting message that he was hoping for. Go find someone else to take over your work because you're not going to be doing it that much longer. I guess that proves the truth of saying be careful what you wish for. Elijah got his response from God, but it was not the one he was expecting or hoping for. And the man who is possessed by the demons in the gospel doesn't actually ask for God's help at first. He tries to avoid it. But after Jesus has healed him and he sent the pigs running over the cliff into the sea, and by the way, I love this story because it's the only one of Jesus' miracles where everybody in the town doesn't rejoice and run and bring out all their sick people for him to heal. They just kind of look around and go, "Please leave." The healed man is just so elated, as he naturally would be, that he wants to just follow Jesus right there, become one of his companions. And the message that Jesus gives him is, no, I want you to stay here in this hostile, suspicious community that doesn't trust me or you, and preach to them. Yay! I think that's why I suspect a whole lot of other people, are so uncomfortable waiting for God in the silence. In silence, after the tides of the emotion have swept over us, we've gotten to the calm place of reason, we can't hide from what God is telling us about the situation, whether or not it's what we want to hear. There's a story about asking God for answers that has been around for a long time. I have no idea who first came up with it. I've heard it in a couple of sermons before. You may have too. But in this story, a man has the opportunity to sit down with Jesus and ask him whatever question he wants. So he says, why do you allow such horrible things to happen in the world, like war and disease and murder and terrorism and all those awful things? And Jesus says, it's funny you should bring that up. I was planning to ask you the same thing. So, as we find ourselves calming down and processing news that we've heard, coming to grips with this newest tragedy in our midst, of course, we're going to talk to God about how awful it is, and how angry and scared and unhappy we are, and how something has to be done. But don't be surprised if when you get to the point where you hear the answer, that the voice coming out of the silence is saying, yes, what are you going to do about it? Thank you.